So I'm sure we'll see a few more people trickling in, but I want to thank everyone so much for coming. It's so wonderful to see everybody joining us from all across the province. I want to note that the session's being recorded, so we're hoping to make some of the content available afterward to people who couldn't attend. We're not sure yet what form that will take, but we are recording the main session. The breakout room content will not be recorded. My name's Jocelyn Badley. I'm one of the TAL staff that's organizing this speaker series, and we're going to be holding a whole series of these events throughout 2022, featuring speakers who will bring their knowledge and a wide variety of perspectives to a series of conversations about the future. So it's our hope that you can use these new approaches and this information to help you plan for the future of your own libraries and your staff, as well as the library community in general in Alberta and for the Alberta Library itself. I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement, and then I'll ask TAL CEO Margaret Law to say a few words about the inspiration for this workshop series. We wish to acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subject to treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. We're grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who've gone before us. Now I'd like to introduce Margaret Law, the CEO of TAL, and she's going to explain a little bit about the inspiration for this workshop series.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And I would like to thank Jocelyn because she's doing all the work on this. I just have to show up and introduce things. So first of all, welcome everybody. It is great to see so many people. This year, 2022, is TAL's 25th anniversary. And we decided rather than having a birthday party, to mark the event by a year-long series of activities focused on the future. The inspiration for this was that's how TAL started. It was an effort of people coming together to try and come up with a strategy to deal with an unstable and uncertain future. Does that sound familiar to people? It probably should. So what we thought was, rather than looking back, we would spend the year looking forward. Recognizing that we need new skills to do that. We need some new strategies. We need to rethink our ways of planning. And so we're hoping that by the end of the year, we will have exposed you to a whole variety of information and skills and looking forward to the future. At the end, in December, all of the members will be invited to send a representative to a party where there will be a cake, and where we are assuming that things go well, it'll actually be in person, and we'll have an opportunity to come together face to face and talk about, what does TAL do next? Do we repeat the same 25 years, or do we actually branch out and find new ways to work with our members? I'd like to thank the University of Calgary Library and the EBSCO Foundation. It is through their support that we've been able to make this whole series free to our members. That supports TAL's value of bringing together everybody across the province and not omitting people just because they don't have enough money to participate. So here we are. This is the beginning, the kickoff. I'm really glad to be here with you, and we'll see how it unfolds. So thanks for being here.
Great, thank you, Margaret. Now I would like to introduce our speakers, Michele Chaboudy and Peter Bishop. So Michele has over 30 years of very varied experience, including a background as a librarian. I was excited to learn. She's been a senior executive, an entrepreneur, and a consultant in several business sectors. She was a pioneer in the early internet industry. She was on the founding teams of 5 different tech startups in Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas. Michele has international experience in product management, business development, strategic planning. She taught global marketing at Golden State University in San Francisco for several years. And currently she serves as president of the World Affairs Council of Sonoma County, as vice chair of the North Bay Angels, and she's on the adjunct faculty of Santa Rosa Junior College, teaching innovation in its entrepreneurship program. And Dr. Peter Bishop is the founder and executive director of Teach the Future, an organization whose mission is to encourage and support educators who want to include futures thinking in their classes and schools at all levels around the world. In 2013, Dr. Bishop retired as a professor emeritus of strategic foresight and director of the graduate program in foresight at the University of Houston. He has published 2 books on strategic foresight, both with co-author Andy Hines. Dr. Bishop is a founding board member and chair of the membership committee for the Association of Professional Futurists. So we are so excited at TEL to have them here, and I hope that you are all excited as well. Thank you, Michele and Peter. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And believe it or not, for all the preparation that Michele and I did, we didn't decide who's going to go first. So, let me start out. So it's a pleasure to be with you all. Thanks to Margaret and to Carla for inviting us to share what is, we believe, new and exciting ways of dealing with the future. I have a little bit more to say about that in a moment. Let me tell you, first of all, where we come from, where I come from, and then about the field of foresight in a little bit. And then I'll ask Michele to do the same thing and tell her story, and also brief you a little bit on what her contribution to these sessions will be. I call myself the accidental futurist because I became a futurist purely by dumb luck. I would like to think that I was, woke up one day when I was 7 years old and said, oh, I want to be a futurist. And guess what happened? No, it didn't work out that way at all. I did got close. I was going to be a physicist. Glad I'm not. Don't think I would be very good. And I chose to switch over to sociology in 1968, 69. If you remember, those were turbulent times as well, very much, particularly in the United States. So I said what was going on in the street was a lot more interesting than what was going on in the physics lab. And I switched and took my degree in sociology from Michigan State University. I wanted to study social change, revolution. My master's thesis, I gave surveys to students who were on buses going to Washington to protest the war in Vietnam in 1970, 71. I think I probably have the only distinction in which it did a formal sociological survey and a master's thesis where half of the subjects were stoned when they filled out the survey. So back then that was quite a recreational thing, even among students. Even Michigan State, which was a pretty, was not the University of Michigan, but it was fun. I did my dissertation on an intervention with a health planning agency in Lansing, Michigan, to increase the citizen participation. There were citizens on the board, but they were not really engaged, and we got them engaged and politicized almost. So both of those had to do about the future. I was interested in social change. I was recruited to the University of Houston, Clear Lake in 1976 to teach largely not sociology, even certainly not futures, but statistics and research methods. I met the dean of that school. It was a brand new campus in Houston. In those days, Texas was making, in the 70s, they were making a lot of money with the bump in the oil prices, and they, to their good credit, spent a lot of that on new campuses and new educational opportunities within the state of Texas. Clear Lake was a campus of the University of Houston, new campus. So the deans were traveling around the country interviewing people rather than bringing folks in one at a time. And I had lunch with the dean of human sciences and humanities in the Atlanta airport where I was teaching in Georgia. At the end of the lunch, I said, sir, I noticed something in the catalog that says Studies of the Future. What is that? And he's a very, very sharp character, brilliant and creative. And he said, well, we study the past, don't we? I said, yeah. Why can't we study the future? Well, I was at that time a scientific sociologist, and I knew had a lot of reasons, like it doesn't exist. How does it, let's start there. But I wanted the job, so I kept my mouth shut and got the job and came to Clear Lake in Houston in 1976. There was a faculty, there was a degree. The very first degree in future studies in the world was established there at Clear Lake, which is down by the Johnson Space Center in outside of Houston. So I hung out with the faculty, and then it took me 5 or 6 years, I'm sorry to say, embarrassed to say. I said, wait a minute, social change, the future change. Oh, I could do this. This is what I've been looking for all my life, and it was right there. So I asked if I could teach the forecasting course in the program, and they said, sure, you can do that if you also run the program. And the academic hierarchy is generally upside down. The youngest guy, the newbie, has to talk to the dean and do the schedule and all that kind of stuff. So I did that and ran that program for 30 years. Learned a lot, and indeed, it is the fulfillment of my hope and my goal and my vision a long time to study social change and to be involved in it. So I'm delighted to do that. As Jocelyn said, I retired in 2013, turned it over to my colleague Andy Hines, the program, and he's been doing a great job since then. And I realized that we had been teaching graduate students, and by that time, there were a half a dozen degree programs around the world teaching graduate students. We had a certificate program that was a 1-week program for adults. And I also started a similar program with the Conference Board of Canada. If my memory serves, Carl, I think you took that that one, and therefore we're here today. So way leads on to way, and there's dominoes falling all over the place. So I realized in 2013 and a few years even before that we were all talking to adults, which we have to. I mean, they're the ones with influence, but nobody was talking to young people. The future was rarely mentioned in school, certainly not in any formal way. And I have a whole pitch on that, and I'll talk about that after our first break, why I think that is. But I said, we need to bring this to the younger people in school, both particularly secondary school students and high school and college undergraduates, so that they can start thinking about the future in a contemporary way, not the way we developed it in the 20th century, which was fine and good, but not complete and not adequate. So my mission right now is to bring futures thinking both to adults in settings like this and the conference board and other seminars. We use a different brand for that. We call it Foresight Fundamentals, but it's the same thing, teaching the future, and the Foresight Fundamentals actually supports our Teach the Future mission. So it's they're linked very closely together. So it's my pleasure to be with you today because, and I'll finish up in just a moment, the foresight is a new way of thinking about the future. And we will go into that today as primarily introductions and this idea of foresight. We are in special times, as Margaret mentioned. We are in turbulent times, and I think the key insight of foresight is that we can no longer assume that we know what's going to happen. We have to deal with uncertainty. We have to deal with disruptions, and that's our message, and that's what we were talking about today primarily, and doing those kinds of things. So let me turn it to Michele. Michele, I'll take it back and talk about the agenda and all that after you kind of tell your story. And we can go on then with the rest of our class.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter, and hi, everyone. We are delighted to be here with you on Zoom. In person would be great, but Zoom does have some advantages. I'm teaching a Zoom class this semester, so I've seen firsthand what works and what hiccups can happen. I'm not convinced that technology always makes things easier, but speaking of technology, I've been immersed in the high-tech space since 1996, when I took a leap from the corporate world to the startup scene in San Francisco. I had been a business executive for large newspapers for 10 years, so it was natural for me to join an online news startup. The first one was Wired News and then MarketWatch.com. Now I'm giving back, so to speak, teaching college students and advising startups who have very limited resources for the most part. Two other things that keep me busy are serving as president of our local World Affairs Council, and I serve on the board of our North Bay Angel Investment Group. And with them, I am reviewing probably 10 startups a month. So I see a lot of innovation out there in all kinds of categories. So today starts our journey into a world of new ideas and how to look at things differently. Peter will handle the future planning part, and I'll ask you to hop aboard our train ride through the hills and valleys of entrepreneurship, innovation, and creativity. Since I've been in the startup venture arena for many years, I've seen lots of hills and valleys. Out of 5 startups, 2 were successful, 3 were not. However, in startup situations, even a failure can sprout another venture. I even used my library science degree in one startup. Some of you may remember the Hotbot search engine. It was a sister company to Wired News, which was an extension of Wired Magazine. And my job was to help develop the search algorithm for corporate librarians and then try to convince them to use it. Back then, our competition was dialogue for the most part. Google was barely on the scene yet, but I digress. So along our train ride through the hills and valleys, you'll experience what it takes to develop an entrepreneurship mindset. Nothing mysterious here, simply a mindset built around curiosity, asking why a lot, and working on collaboration skills. Since I teach innovation at a local junior college, I am thrust into the younger generation who are looking at a screen almost all the time. Quite honestly, I'm constantly encouraging to get outside, away from the devices, and do more real world investigation and collaboration. Go out and meet lots of people. Next week in session 2, I'll answer 2 questions. What is entrepreneurship and what is innovation? We'll dive into the innovation engine concept and split into groups to discuss its interconnections. One of my colleagues at Stanford is named Tina Seelig, and she's written a great book called Ingenious, which talks all about the innovation engine, and I'll elaborate more on that later next week. After that segment, I'll cover the golden circle concept from Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. I like to include this because Simon provides a companion manual called Find Your Why on how to conduct these exercises if you want to use these down the road in your respective libraries. We'll close our section with a small group activity investigating assumptions by asking why several times, probably at least 5 times. In session 3, we'll talk about creativity and do some exercises to generate ideas. After that, I will introduce the design thinking method, which got its start at an international design agency near Stanford University called IDEO. This is little d design, not fashion design. Now, Stanford's engineering school, as well as universities around the world, use design thinking as a basis for dissecting and solving problems. I will use the problem of gift giving as our subject matter to investigate. This is a very interactive exercise based on interviewing each other to understand the essence of the problem. A key element of this exercise is reframing questions to get to the heart of the issue. Here's an example of reframing and asking a simple question. What is the sum of 5 and 5? And what 2 numbers add up to 10? The first question has 1 answer, whereas the second one has an infinite number of solutions, including negative numbers and fractions. So that gives you an idea of how dramatic reframing can be in some cases. So for our last session in week 4, we will return to the design thinking method to investigate a library topic that is changing rapidly as the future unfolds. Again, understanding assumptions as we move forward will be our first activity in session 4. So we will have follow-up links after each session to videos, books, and articles covered in all 4 weeks. So I had a couple of slides I was going to show you just to give you a flavor for what's coming up. But I guess I have time to do that. Is that okay, Peter? They're just like five slides. So let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see that? Hope so. Okay, so this is the innovation engine, which has a lot of connections. We'll have fun dissecting this. This is the golden circle from Simon Sinek's Start With Why. So it gives you an idea of kind of what's in the middle and what's on the perimeter. This is a presentation I'll give on ideation and get you involved in doing some idea generation. And then these are just some fun photos. I often start sessions with really different things, trying to generate ideas and that type of thing. So this is from Santa Fe, Cowboy from Santa Fe. This is not so good an idea. This is a clock I saw in Santa Fe, which it's like, oh, really? These are children's drawings in elementary school. You know, it's amazing what they come up with. This is a big bunny in Seattle, huge. Loved it. I love bunnies. This is a guy who's thinking. He's doing some design thinking, probably. And this is an artist called Kaws, K-A-W-S, who's famous worldwide on doing huge statues. And he's quite interesting. This is sort of a comfort slide, I will say. And then last but not least, my panda bears. I use pandas a lot, and this one's climbing up into the next startup he's going to think about doing. So that just gives you an idea of what's coming up. So, okay. So Peter, do you want to take it away, or are we? Yeah. Okay.
That's great. No, Michele, this is going to be a lot more fun than most classes I teach. I thank you very much for including all of that. Fun and interesting, and definitely we hope valuable for you as you're moving into this 25th year and the next quarter century, literally. I love the way Margaret set that up. I don't have quite the fun slides that that Michele does, but let me share a couple that more or less set up the whole part, what we're doing here. All right. So the framework here, and we're talking about change. The framework, basically, this is the very first slide that I show in any discussion about change, and it is basically where change comes from. And it sets up the framework for our work here in these 4 sessions, and the difference between what my contribution is and what Michele's contribution is. A change comes from 2 places. It comes from the world to us, and we create change ourselves. We call the first the inbound change, things that happen to us, things we have no control over, no choice. You sit down at a card table, you pick up your hand. It's not, whether you can't get another one. The one you have to play is the one that you have. And the world we have in 2022 and in the 2020s and in the 2030s is the world that we have to deal with. But at the same time, we're not helpless. We're not clueless. We're not without resources and without time and talent to create change as it goes. The division between my tasks and Michele's task is precisely this. I'm a futurist. I talk mostly about the world and how it is changing and how it is likely to change. And we're going to ask you to dive into some of that as well. Michele's job, and you can tell that's the primary part of the class, is the outbound change. How to think creatively, strategically, how to design with people in mind and with the future in mind. So basically, and I'll show the agenda here in a second, you'll see that our agenda is built around these 2 things. Now, these 2 things are what I'll call analytical distinctions. They are intellectual distinctions. However, they are always operating simultaneously on each other all the time. We change the world through our actions. The world changes us through its actions. And both of these are actually in interaction all the time. We can't have the future we want, but we can have more of it if we work towards it. We can't control what the world does, but we can influence it to be a little bit more towards our preferred future. So that's basically the setup and how this whole class that Michele and I have put together, this whole class on this. All right, so as I mentioned, our first topic is change, and it really is about something, as I said, that we talk about all the time, we feel about it all the time, we're worried about it and how to deal with it, and we rarely ever explicitly discuss it. And so this is kind of a little introduction to change, because how we deal with the future, of course, is all about change. And if we didn't have change, we wouldn't be talking about any kind of a different future. So let's get on with it. The very first slide here is really about the fact that I started my career in sociology to study social change. It turned out that the gentleman who is considered to have founded the science of sociology, or the social science there, early in the 19th century, Auguste Comte, basically saw the study of groups and societies and organizations in two divisions. One is he calls social statics, how these things were put together, what its parts were, the relationships of parts and things like that. And the second were social dynamics, the changing of those parts. It turns out that for maybe some good reasons, but also because of how science and academics have developed since then, almost all of the attention in sociology, at least, and in many of the other disciplines, is on the statics part, on how organizations and societies, what the pieces are and how they relate to each other, and very little on the dynamics part. I had this hypothesis when I was looking at this some years ago, and I went on to Amazon and selected the top 10 introductory sociology textbooks and looked at their table of contents. Well, when I first did this in 2007, 3 of the top 10 didn't even have a chapter on social change. All on family, institutions, deviance, all that kind of stuff. When I looked at again in 2013, every book had a chapter on social change. Thank you very much. But in every single case, it was the last chapter. So don't tell me that anybody really gets to the last chapter in a class. This is getting ready for final exams, going to Christmas break and all that. You can read that on your own. Well, I don't doubt that very many people did. So this is really to kind of remedy that and give us some ideas. There are 4 attributes I'll talk about. I'll talk about each one of these that more or less classifies social changes so that we can have a better understanding, number one, of what's going on. And we have a language and a vocabulary to talk about change. But it's also, this is the theoretical basis, more or less, of forecasting and how we go about thinking about the future, which is going to be the product of changes as it goes about. So the very first one, as I pointed out, is that change comes from 2 places. It comes from the world and it comes from ourselves, both operating simultaneously and in very close interaction with each other. Don't have to say much more about that, except that this section, Foresight, tends to be more about inbound change. I'll have more to say about creating change and implementing change as the very last module of our class. Michele's contributions are mostly about thinking about change, ideation, and then indeed designing a solution to address a problem or to capitalize on an opportunity. So most of the class, I would say, 2/3 of the class is really about the outbound section. So I'm going to do these 2 modules today and then essentially turn it over to her to do a lot of the rest of it. Another attribute of change is where change occurs, at what level, and we have various levels. We talk about an enterprise, and an enterprise is a fairly general term. It's quite ambiguous. An enterprise could be a company, like Michele works with, startups. It could be a library. It could be the whole system of libraries in Alberta or in Canada or in the world. It could be a government agency. It could be a country, anything that and indeed, that's of the larger enterprises. It could be an individual or a family or a small business or a community. It's basically everything from one person to all the people in the world are a type of enterprise. And that enterprise lives in a couple of different environments. The first environment is we call it the transactional environment. And that's the environment in which that the enterprise interacts with or transacts with on a very frequent basis, daily, maybe weekly. Some of the questions you asked in the last discussion, how do you deal with legislators? And how do you deal with vendors? And how do you deal with, indeed, your public and your visitors and people like that, the suppliers? So these are all part of the transactional environment. Not being a library person, the way Michele is and yourselves, we'll have very little to say in substance about the transactional environment, except to say all the changes that go on elsewhere within the enterprise and within this larger environment can be applied to the transactional environment as well. But the emphasis for foresight is on this steep environment, sometimes called a global environment, in which we tend to divide it into 5 or 6 sectors. It's the part of the world outside the transactional environment, larger than, and as a result, it's kind of distant. Most people don't believe they have much time to pay attention to that. But this is the area where foresight professionals, it's their specialty. It is a vast area because it has all of these various categories in it, the social, demographic, economic, technological. It is impossible to know all about all of these things, but if we forget anything, it is bound to be a source of change and something that will surprise us. So we try and cover at least something in all of these different areas when we do formal forecasting. We're not going to do formal forecasting in this class, but thinking about how all of these things interact with each other and how they influence the transactional environment and ultimately the enterprise is an attitude, it's a mindset, it's vast. We can't know everything. You know everything there is to know, or almost a lot more than almost anybody else about library science and running libraries and all of that. It is impossible to get that depth of knowledge with any of these steep categories, but we need to be aware that they're out there and that they're humming along, producing change and producing inbound change. So we have this, there is a model of the transactional environment. Many people in business school will study it. It has to do with competitors and suppliers. Foresight professionals tend not to deal with this very much. This is more traditional management consulting, business and public administration. What we deal with is the various sectors so people use technology to transform resources and society into economic goods and services, and unfortunately waste products under some kind of government oversight in a cultural context. Each of these is a source of change, and each of them have subcategories. So you see how vast all this stuff is. It is impossible to know it all. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention once in a while. Now, you're not going to be futurists, you're librarians, you're managers and those kinds of things. So we're not asking everyone to do this. I do this, my colleagues do this, but for the most part, we're saying the public ought to be aware that change is happening in all of these areas, and it could come to shape the future, the inbound change you're looking at. And that also has an interaction among itself. We are a people. We are a species, even a biological species, and we live in a habitat. And that habitat is basically the natural world and our planet, and in some extent, outer space. We have the benefit, or the curse maybe, of creating technologies which manipulate that habitat for our benefit, and that is being decided by an economic system, in our case, the market system, or the feudal system, or the communist system that makes decisions about which technologies get developed, who gets them, what impact they have. All within government, under government oversight, and within a cultural context. So we're trying to keep all of these things straight as we're thinking about change from the outside. So sources of change, 2 kinds, levels of change, 6 levels. The third attribute is how long change occurs. The very shortest kinds of changes we call the operational changes, things like, well, I'm going to take a trip go visit my family or go visit go to a conference. That's a short-term operational change. It is change, but it generally takes fairly short periods of time, making decisions. And most of our life is in the short term. People bemoan that, oh, I spent all of my time, but even long-term futurists have to, prepare classes, they have to pay bills, they have to maintain an office or a business. So almost everybody's, I would say everybody's work, I would say, is a very high percentage of operational change. That doesn't mean that everything should be, but 80% is not so high. That you got to keep the doors open, you got to keep the wheels turning, going along. Once in a while, we adopt a new system, a new computer system, a new accounting system, hiring, some kind of a new regulatory system, and that takes a little bit longer to make that change happen, weeks and months maybe, and is that systemic change. Strategic change takes longer than that. We're trying to achieve goals, important goals, and it'll take a while to get to those goals. We can't order them up as we can with short-term operational or medium-term systemic changes. And then finally, there's the opportunity to transform organizations. You're going to have a discussion in December about whether libraries should become different, change their very identity, and those can take months, if not decades. A few companies in the world have actually gone through that process successfully. I would hurry on to say that most do not. Once they have a particular identity, it's very, very hard to change that identity. Even in interpersonal change, sometimes if you want to be somebody different, it's very difficult. We're one particular way. So we try to be patient. We watch change. We work on change. And the kind of changes that we're talking about in Foresight tend to be strategic. So they tend to be multi-year projects. It's not going to happen right away. We're going to take our time. We're going to work at it, but it's not something that we can order up right away. And the last attribute of change, an extremely important one, is how fast change occurs. There is continuous change, and most of the change that we talk about and know about is this type. It's incremental. It's you can put it on a graph. You can get a time series even if you're mathematically inclined, and you can do extrapolations. So people really kind of like that kind of change because it's manageable, it's understandable, even to some extent predictable. So I'm thinking of temperatures on the planet, the number of people on the planet, the growth of an economy tends to go on over the long run, at least, in some kind of trends, continuous change. Once in a while, however, and now we believe more frequently than ever, disruptions occur, and that's called discontinuous change. This is borrowed a term from math where you have a curve and then all of a sudden it jumps to one other place. These are the mathematical functions that actually do that. It happens that way also in social change. It's and those tend to be events. So trends tend to be continuous change over time. They are changing the future, no doubt. Takes some time. We kind of get ready for it. We kind of know what's going on. Events also change the future, but they do so in a relatively unexpected and surprising way. This is a continuum. Sometimes it's more continuous, sometimes it's more discontinuous. The problem is that when we think about the future compared to the past, we're really thinking more about trends. When you think about the past, however, think of your history class. It was all events for the most part. We really didn't, we may have seen a chart on the history of the world's population or the history of technology or something like that, but rarely do you see charts in a history class. It's all about people, what they did, what they didn't do, natural disasters, new technologies, new inventions, revolutions, wars. Notice that all of those things are events. The problem of dealing with the future, however, is that we don't tend to put events into the future, because in an evidence-based, sometimes called hyper-scientific culture, you have to have empirical basis. You have to be able to know when an event will occur and how disruptive it will be. We do have some scheduled events. I mean, we have the yearly events of the calendar, of course, and in the US, elections, for instance, are very set, 2 years, 5 years, cities, municipalities, states, and the nation itself has predictable elections. Of course, we don't know who's going to be running and what the effects will be, but in some cases, events. So sports have scheduled events. other items in our society have scheduled events. But the events that we're most concerned about are those that are unexpected and coming on their own. We're not allowed, unfortunately, usually to say, here's what about this event? The problem is, if we don't think about events, we're also we're putting ourselves at risk for being the victims of events if we don't think about them. So the paradox is that we have to think about things, and we have to practice things that we can't predict. And in that sense, most people will back off and say, well, if you can't tell me what's going to happen, then I'll just continue to go along. I'll continue to work the trends and not think about those events. That tends to be a fairly risky operation. And I'll talk later about how to prepare for unexpected events. There are various continuous changes mathematically, different kinds of models, and people use these all the time. Econometrics, a very sophisticated way of looking at society, the economy of society. Population uses these things as well. Pace layers is an interesting concept because this is another kind of like the steep categories, fairly related to it. And it was developed that some of these things change fairly rapidly in terms of rate, and some change more slowly, and then more and more slowly. So fashion, of course, has fads, and it's something that, people are in, people are out, it's hot, it's not. That was so last year. No, we have to now change very rapidly. Business is a fairly fast moving, some businesses faster than others. The infrastructure, our road systems, our power grid, our water systems, they tend more slowly, governance more slowly than that, all the way down to nature itself, which is fairly stable, except for once in a while there'll be an earthquake or there'll be the kind of snowstorm that you all talked about earlier. But for the most part, nature is the slowest moving, and yet in the long run, big changes happen in nature as well. So what does disruptive change look like? Well, we use this curve called an S curve. It has the shape of an S. And when we begin when we start, we use a concept called an era, a period of time that has a kind of an identity. The Depression was an era. The Cold War was an era. The Renaissance was an era. Historians don't really like eras because it's very hard to document them exactly when they started and when they stopped. But we use the concept because it indicates discontinuous change. Usually, if we are forecasting from the old era, from the current era, we just use trends and we just extrapolate out straight lines or curved lines in continuous fashion. What happens, however, is that an event will occur and it will start the process of the transition from one era to another era. And that transition is marked by difficulties and problems. The old era doesn't seem to work anymore, but we're not at the new era yet. We spend a lot of money that we shouldn't have spent. We make a lot of decisions that don't seem to work really well. And people feel bad. They feel like they're doing something wrong. But that kind of transition is just built into the cake. You do not get to a new era unless you have that. The new era then ultimately the S curve levels off. The transitional changes do take hold, and we come into what people would call a new normal. We may be approaching that, for instance, when we change the status of a virus from a pandemic which is a virulent disease, to an endemic, like flu or colds or other diseases. It's just with us. We will deal with it as best we can, but it's not something that is going to disrupt our lives as much as before. So this S curve is a very popular and a very interesting way. So the question is what transitions are we in? When was the last time an event occurred that really upset a particular era, a domain like libraries, or your particular library, or your city, or the province? And how did that transition go? In fact, that will be the nature of the discussion that I'll ask you to have this morning, which is when do those eras change? So examples of disruptions. This is just my list of disruptions since, say, 1970, the last 50 years or so. A lot of these things disrupted industries. Every one of these industries has had to face the fact that they're not what they were before. They had to learn a new way of doing business. They had to learn skills. and practices that were not particularly comfortable at the beginning, and it also changed our lifestyles. Many of the things in society changed because of these disruptions. So the last 50 years have been quite disruptive. You can go back further than that. Does that mean the next 50 years will be less disruptive? Probably not. Even though we don't know what the disruptions are, we do prepare for them anyway. This is another way of thinking about changes from one era to the other. It's called three horizons. And the three horizons are the current era, which, as you can see, the first horizon is going away. It's changing. It's becoming less useful and is somewhat obsolete. Not quite. It wasn't as vigorous and as useful as it was when it started. The last horizon, the third horizon, is the visionary horizon. This is where we're headed. This is what the visionary future is. We had a visionary future for the internet, for instance, in the 1990s as citizen journalism and contact with everyone and basically essentially negligible looking up for information that to some extent has taken hold, and that many other things have occurred as well. The transition in this formulation is the second horizon, where the transition, when the old era is not as good as it used to be, the new era is not there yet, and this is where the problems are. This is where difficulties and part of the transition. What's interesting about these three eras, however, is that each one is managed by and has a certain mindset associated with it. The first horizon I would call the managerial mindset, making things better, effective, efficient. And there's some change in there. It tends to be incremental, it tends to be continuous, and managers are very good at doing this kind of thing. The third horizon is basically the subject of visionaries, people who are imagining alternatives, new eras, both good and bad, in terms of how the new era could be. And yet the middle group, and particularly for our point here, is the entrepreneurial era, entrepreneurial horizon. Entrepreneurs like the fact that the old era is going away. They don't necessarily celebrate the mistakes and the problems, but they do see opportunity there, opportunity to create change that was probably impossible during the old era. We realize that in some extent, the pandemic gave us the chance to do things that we never did before. Some of it was welcome, some of it was not, but entrepreneurs were capitalizing on this change, this transition period. The transition period doesn't last forever, however. Once the new era does become solid, it also is harder to be an entrepreneur, harder to do these kind of changes. So thinking as Michele will talk about next week, thinking in an entrepreneurial mindset, where are the transitions occurring in society, and where can we interject ourselves and actually get our goals met, because the resistance to change is not what it was, and we're not into a new era that creates new forms of resistance. So various kinds of examples. When the transistor was invented in 1947, you see how the curve went from flat to basically increasing. Divorce rates in the 1970s, the housing crisis and the bubble there in 2000. And then finally, the reconstructed temperatures in the planet, which are now even considerably more than that. So we think about these eras not only in terms of biology and geology. Darwin didn't have this concept in his books on natural selection. He thought it was all gradual. Species basically changed over time, which they do, but then we dug up the fossil records and found out that there were these eras, and we now call them Cenozoic and the Mesozoic, and the various dates and the periods of those. So that's a very common, in geology and biology, a very common concept. We apply that concept to future studies as well. We come up with this model called punctuated equilibrium, that it's trends until they stop, until they're disrupted, transition, new era, till it goes on until a new event comes and a new transition occurs. So thinking of this gives us the opportunity both to envision a world that is slightly different than today as a result of trends, more computers, more climate change, more population, larger economy, all of those things, but also to be ready when those disruptions occur to move, to be flexible, to be resilient, to say, well, I guess the change is on us now, and we better do something about it. Now, the timing of that is always a matter of disagreement. Some people want to change right now, and some people say, wait a minute, now it's not time yet. Some people want to change everything, and others want to kind of tweak the system, and that's a very legitimate disagreement of opinion. It's not a conflict. Those people getting together and coming up with an accommodated solution will probably as close to when is it time to actually pull the trigger? When is it time to create this? We don't always want to create disruptive change. On the other hand, we don't want to go on too long. So various civilizations, we've had these eras, energy transitions in each of those. The transportation has changed in these same kind of S curves. And there we talk about the law of diminishing returns. The reason that it is necessary to create a new era is that we're at the ceiling, we're at the top of the S curve. Any system that you have, take the library system, we're at the top of, it may be at the top of the S curve, trying to add people and add money and whatever, not necessarily bumps up against the ceiling. And so we get less bang for the buck by adding increments. Inputs or outputs are not proportional to the inputs we put in. And therefore we have this inherent capacity of performance. Every system, whether it's an automobile or whether it's a country or whether it's whatever technology or social system there is able to do some things, but can't do exactly what we want. So how do we get to substantial change? How do we create real social change? And that is when we, press the wrong thing. All right. Okay, it's when we go from the old era to the new era. But to do that, we can't just attach the new era to the top of the S curve. We first have to dismantle things. If you want to redecorate your kitchen, you first have to take out the other stuff. That tends to be a dusty, risky, process. But you have to destroy some things before you get started. That's I think a lot of the reason why people don't like to change. I like it. I mean, it's not perfect. Yeah, I understand we've got problems, but do we really have to give it up? Do we really have to replace it with something new? So this gap is also part of this transition in order to become. So the problems are inevitable, but they're investments towards a better future. Sometimes that better future does not occur. We destroy a lot and the contractor goes out of business, or we don't get what we were looking for or what we wanted. In that sense, it's a risk, and every investment has a risk. We could also have what's called overshoot and collapse. We could get so high up, like the housing bubble, that it cannot sustain itself and it will collapse back again. Is the environment like that? Is the economy like that? Is the internet itself like that? Are we beyond the ability to sustain itself, and will we fall back to some lower level? All of these are potential outcomes to the gap here. And finally, I point out that some things don't change. And this is a kind of almost heresy from a futurist point of view. Change, 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 change. No, there's like straighta, and we can change some things, and we're not allowed to, and we don't change. So the mission, our values, our integrity, those kinds of things are perennial in most cases, and we bank on those. All we're going to do is change how we do it. The how oftentimes changes faster, like the pace layers, than the fundamentals do. And in that sense, we're doing this other kinds of things. So let me stop here then and ask if anybody has any questions or comments. Michele, anything in the chat came up that we should address before we go on into a discussion?
No, I've just been monitoring it and I don't see anything new.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on these attributes of change? And if you think about change this way, I believe it is possible to talk about change in a professional capacity and with the right kind of language. We're not criticizing. We're not saying the past is bad or the present is bad. We're saying, however, that change oftentimes is extremely important. My 10 seconds up, Michele?
Sorry, I have one.
Okay, yes.
Can you
Karen.
give another example of nothing changes everything? I'm still kind of trying to ponder that one.
Well, and I'm actually criticizing some of my colleagues in the futures world. You've been maybe entertained by them at a conference or a keynote speech in which it's, oh my God. I mean, I call them the breathless futurists. So has the internet changed everything? It's changed a lot. I said it's a disruption, but in some cases, your libraries are what they were before the internet. Different, yes, but not everything. So your mission to assist people, and I'll paraphrase this, you can come up with your own, to assist people in dealing with information and that, which in the printed era was one process, but in the internet and the electronic and the digital era is a different process. But your mission is the same, to help people manage the information in their lives, if I could paraphrase your mission. So that doesn't change. And to give people, when you go into advocating for change, it's always important to reiterate that we're not changing everything. We're maybe changing a lot. And some people will think it's too much, granted, and that's where the discussion is. But it is not everything. We're trying to accomplish the same thing using the means of the moment rather than the means of the past. And I think that I would hope that that's an argument that people would listen to. Now, they may not like it, but at least they have to admit, okay, we're not changing our fundamental function in society. Okay, Karen? Good. All right. That's that. And so it's part of really promoting change and telling people, we're not jumping off a cliff. We're not killing ourselves. We are changing a lot, but not everything. Great. Thanks, Karen. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Peter, an example in the library where, not everything changes, but what if you decided to be having snacks for everybody, and it was a place to come where you got coffee and you had all these vending machines and everything. Mm-hmm. But you know what? You could put that all in one room, and have that be a restaurant, if you will, or whatever. But nothing else really changes. But
it doesn't have to.
Yeah. So.
And you're going to do an exercise, I think, about the libraries where that will be important. And I mean by everything, I really mean everything. The building is the same. The staff is the same. People are coming into that building for slightly different reasons, but in some cases for the exact same reasons. They're looking for information. They're looking for advice and help. So that not everything changes all at once. And I've listened to futurists go on and on. Everything's going to change. The internet, the world is a completely different. Whoa, hold on. Not everything. Lot, but not everything. Great. You will see why I have this image about the future as we get into this. But first of all, I'm going to pick up on the same word that Sharon talks about. It's a way of thinking about change. That was the last module, and this is a way of thinking about the inbound future. This is the place which is the world, both the global world and the steep categories, the big world, the transactional world that you live in, or even inside the enterprise. All of these things apply to all of these different places. So I always begin, being an educator, I begin with education as the lead-in here. How did we learn about the future as young people, as very young or secondary school, college, those kinds of things? I dare say that very few of us ever had a class or even a course on that. But we picked up various ideas about the future that were consistent with our culture, consistent with our mindsets going forward. And I have 5 of those, and we'll see one reason why this does not come up in school, because teachers don't know how to deal with these 5 at the same time. The first of these, and believe it or not, part of what we knew about the future is that it was predictable. You did a science experiment, whether in physics or chemistry, and there was a process, and you did it well, and you did the calculations, and you came up with the answer you expected. Science, in the end of the day, is attempting to be, and much of it is, physical science particularly, is quite predictable. So we said, gee, if we can predict the phases of the moon, why can't we predict the state of the economy or the outcome of an election? And that's a generalization from one form of science to another form of science. But the result was that we thought of the future as and the metaphor is it's like a road. It's like a journey, and it has one path, and it results in a destination. So our job when we think about the future, we think, is to figure out where does the road end? What is the destination that we're going to arrive at? And I will point out that that's the wrong question. Don't do that. It's a waste of time. It also creates a type of false certainty that you think you know where the road will end. You don't. And so again, foresight doesn't, well, I don't think we celebrate uncertainty, but we use it and we say it's there too. A second class, we learned about the future, really in learning about the past, is that it's kind of inevitable, deterministic, if you will. Most people won't go to pure determinism, but when we look at the past, all of the events of the past seem to have causes. They had reasons. And so we think, well, if that was the past, then the future will have causes and reasons, and whatever happens is more or less had to be. It had to be caused by these kinds of things. So again, our purpose was to figure out, well, if the causes in the present are this, then the effects in the future will be this. And we were looking again for certainty. We wanted to know what the future will be. Wrong question, but it is definitely our culture. We really strive for that kind of certainty. And that was until we went to college, or maybe even in high school, and we took a social science class. Well, if you know any social scientists, you know they don't know much about the future. It is a complicated thing, whether it's politics or economics or group organizational life. And indeed, it involves certain things that we have no real good idea of. I mean, physics was complicated before Newton simplified it for us. Biology was complicated until Darwin simplified it for us. Maybe somebody will come along and simplify human consciousness, personality, the ability to know ourselves and predict ourselves. Maybe that will happen in the future. I don't expect it, but maybe it will. But it hasn't. And so at the core of social science is this thing called a human being, whether as an individual or as groups, which are almost completely unpredictable. And in that sense, it may be a road, but it's a road on the other side of the fog. Trying to figure out where the road goes is not going to help us very much. There's also, in statistics class, we learned about randomness. We learned that there are things that are inherently unpredictable, flipping coins and rolling dice and all of those kinds of things. So is the future predictable and inevitable, or is it unknowable and indeed maybe even random? And those are four concepts, and teachers that do not know how to handle these concepts at the same time do not know how to teach it, and therefore they rarely mention the future. And it's a professional responsibility. I don't know what I'm talking about, and therefore I'm not going to bring it up in class. That's not a bad idea. Don't bring up the wrong thing, but in this case. And then there's a fifth way of thinking about the future, and that puts us in the loop. This is the outbound change part. I can choose my future. It's a very famous phrase. The best way to predict the future is to create it, which, as in all truisms, is partially true, but not completely true. We can't create the future that we want. We can have more of it, closer to it, the more we work at it. But to say that we are going to control the world and the future, even our own future, is naive. It's not. And so now we're really confused. Now we don't know. Is the future predictable and inevitable, deterministic to some extent, to a large extent, or is it largely unknown and random? Is it up to us to determine the future, or is it up to the world to determine the future? And the answers to these questions are all of the above. The way we think about the future in future studies is to think about four different mechanisms of how change occurs. First of all, the future is not many. It is not one future. It is many futures. And the many futures are due to these. And that was my insight. Well, I actually wrote a little memo to the faculty of the futures when I first took over the program and started teaching the program. I says, what is all this about? Uncertainty. We're scientists. We should do the research. We should figure out how the world works, even in a social sense. And then about 6 months later, and they didn't kick me out for doing that. 6 months later, I realized this is a different phenomenon. This is not physics. This is not chemistry. This is a different phenomenon, which therefore requires a different process, a different approach, a different set of assumptions. And one of those assumptions is that there is no one future. Now, there may be one present. We may be in one present right now, and this used to be part of the future, but it was only one of many futures. And when we think about the future, the foresight professional, or even a mindset, not a professional, everyone should be saying, what do you, in answer to the question, and I really had to train myself out of answering the question, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, I'm a college professor, I'm giving speeches, I'm doing consulting. What do you think is going to happen? And I forced myself to preface everything I said with, I'm a futurist, let me give you some alternatives. Forcing ourselves to always think about alternatives. Now, some of those alternatives are so obvious as to say, well, there's really no other alternative. There are, but they're not enough to pay attention to. That's not very common, however, in social life, in economic, political life. It is very common that there are many futures, not just one. And that's why the river delta is my image of the future. It's not a river with banks and goes a particular place. It's a branching structure. It's like a tree. When ants crawl up a tree, they have choices to go here, there, and everywhere else. So we have choices. We can make those choices. And that river delta, the water flows into many, many different channels. A log going down, if you just let yourself float down the river, you'll end up in one of those channels. And because there are always many channels. The mechanisms then. There is momentum, trends, continuous change is momentum. Things that are changing in a particular direction will most likely continue changing in that direction until they don't. So we're having two mindsets about change. One is that we're heading somewhere, but something might come along to change our course. And that's where the events come in. That's where the disruptions come in. So we're saying here we're on a journey. We're heading in this way. We're preparing for this. We're using the opportunities that presents us. But we're always keeping up, looking out. What might happen? What may be wrong? What may come? And when those things do come, they don't often come with labeled, here's a disruption, begin change. There's a discussion. Is this serious enough? Is it not? Is it something we should pay attention to? Is this going to open up a new era? And then finally, we have choice. We are players. We're sitting at the card table. I got the hand. I know the rules of the game. Now I have to play my hand. And how do I play my hand? How do I use my resources and my time and strategies for not winning the game always, but being successful at the game? And each of these three mechanisms then produces a different type of a future. The future is many, not one. There is one future that is the result of all the momentum that we can sum up all the trends and all the plans that major stakeholders have said and all the projections that the consultants and the government agencies have said. You get what we call the expected future. Some people call that this really began as the probable future, but the problem is it's usually not probable. More than 50% chance that something else will happen. And that's where the alternative futures come in. That's where disruptions, what ifs, what if this happens, what if that happens? Well, then the trends change, the era changes. The rules that were there before are not anymore, and we're developing a new normal, we're developing a new set of things. So keeping both of those things in mind, an expected future, yes, that's where we're headed. Alternative futures, yes, those things are plausible as well. And then there is the choices are our preferred future. Out of all of those alternative futures, which are the ones we prefer? What are our values? What preferences do we have? Where are we most secure? Where are we most successful? And that's our choice. And we're allowed to make that choice. And I would suspect, try to make that choice explicitly. We can't control that future, but it guides our actions. And that's what the last part of this and most of this exercise class is about, is designing, thinking about, first of all, and then designing parts of a system that is your preferred future. So these three futures are ways to think. We're not doing formal scenarios in this class. We're not doing formal plans in this class. You don't have to do those. You can still tell stories about the future. You can still answer the what if questions, and you can say what the preferences and values are that you want without going through a professional and systematic process. Carla went through that process in the conference board class, and she can tell you about how that was put together as we teach people to do it at work. but you're librarians and you're managers, and you don't need to be doing this stuff in a formal sense, but you can still think like a futurist, even though you don't have to practice it exactly that way. And each of these three futures, the baseline, the expected future, the plausible futures, and the preferred future, have different mindsets. The first is scientific, empirical, logical. It's really what everybody is supposed to think about the future. That's the end of the road. That's the expected future. We have lots of data, lots of trends, lots of plans, all constructed to point in that direction. But to come up with you'll never get data to tell you an alternative future. That's a product of imagination. That's a product of creativity. What if this thing happens? Or what are the things that we should be paying attention to? A completely different mindset. So we're asking people to be logical, scientific, and evidence-based. We're also asking them to be imaginative and creative. And that's really where Michele's materials come in. We know we've been taught how to do the one, and we've been kind of suggested to us that we should do the other. We should be creative and imaginative, but without as much emphasis in school or in work. No, we got to have logic. We got to have performance, et cetera, et cetera. No, we should also allow ourselves to imagine alternative futures, positive ones, negative ones, neutral ones, very different ones, very similar ones. This is the product of imagination. And finally, then, the preferred future is based upon our values. What we prefer, we're allowed to say. And that's a third mindset. So we want to have logical thinking, we want to have imaginative thinking, and we want to have value-based thinking, all going on at the same time for the same set of futures as we go forward. This is the picture of where all that comes from. We call it a cone of plausibility. It's not a cone of probability, and it's not a cone of possibility. It's a medium term plausible we use as futures. You say, well, I don't think that's going to happen, but it could. That's the response we want. It's not just possible. Anything's possible. It's not probable because there are many of them. None of them are probably probable. But the cone is a center line, which is the baseline. The expected future may not be straight line, but it's a continuous curve leading to one of those points on that cross section of the cone. Other alternative futures are the other sections of the cone, regions. We can't cover them all, but we cover the most important ones, big regions that way. And then finally, some of that one of those regions or some of those regions are preferred. This is where our values are enhanced, our values are brought to fruition. And so we have all three of these concepts pictured. So thinking of the future, and notice that the farther out in the future you get, the wider the cone is. So you have more possibilities, both for alternative futures and for preferential futures, the farther out. And that's why we're thinking of 5, 10, 20 years. You're thinking of 25 years. Margaret's thinking of what's the Alberta Library going to be like in 25 years? What could it be like in 25 years? What do we want it to be like in 25? And that's where all of that basically comes from. So finally, then, 5 recommendations to implement these ideas in actual practice. The first one may be surprising. You should look to be surprised. Surprise is what happens when a disruptive event occurs, and we haven't thought about it. We're not ready for it. We haven't even thought about any kind of disruptions. And how do we prevent ourselves? Well, the metaphor here is the vaccine. We're very much, more schooled in vaccines now than we ever were before. So we take a little bit of the disease, something that looks like the disease, that basically tunes our immune system. So we look for things, even in our transactional environment or in the global environment, that are not changing the future. They're not important yet, but could they be? And we take a little bit of that all the time. Talk about those things. Did you see this article? Did you hear what that person said? There's this new press release. There's this new trend, et cetera, et cetera. And not to jump off a cliff immediately, but to continually have a discussion about change on the margin, some of which, actually relatively few of which, will come to affect the transactional environment and the enterprise ultimately. But if we pay no attention to them, then we're looking to be surprised. It's a vaccine. Expect the unexpected. These are the astronauts. These are the airline pilots. I don't know whether they tell them what the emergency is going to be. They certainly don't tell them when it's going to occur, but they have to swing into action. And even though something happens that it was not on the training schedule, at least they have the confidence to say, we've swung into action before, we're not going to panic now, we're going to solve this problem. I mean, that was the Apollo 13 mission, famous movie on its way back from the moon. They didn't know that this was going to happen. They didn't have any training protocol for that, but they went ahead and fixed the problem and brought them back safely. So it's conditioning. It's getting ready for change, not necessarily predicting what the disruptions will be, but realizing that there will be unexpected disruptions. Are we good? Are we prepared? Are we resilient? Can we adapt when those things actually come along? Number 3 is to recognize weak signals. A weak signal is a change, a real change, that has not yet affected the future or the present. Strong signals are the trends, plans. When IBM or Microsoft or Apple says, I'm going to do, if Facebook says, we're going to be metaverse and we're going to do the metaverse from now on. Well, that's a plan that is probably going to change the future. They have enormous reach in the ability to do that. Weak signals is when you just see this little odd piece of information. That doesn't make sense. Where did that come from? And the image that I like to use is this bottom picture. There's a creek, of course. Young people walking around in this creek. A day it's a park. It's a park in northern Minnesota, and it's called the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River begins with a creek, and literally, but not that we predict that every weak signal becomes one of the largest river systems in the world, but they all start out that way. So we're just looking at the category of things happening out there, more open to change, less thinking about we know what's going to happen. Challenge assumptions. Assumptions really get a bad reputation in our culture. You're not supposed to make assumptions. You're supposed to always have facts, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let me tell you, if you don't have assumptions, then you can't know anything except what you're directly observing. And even then, there are assumptions involved that philosophers will dither about. But most things we know, most things we say we know, we have to assume. We think we know the temperature on the inside of the sun. Well, nobody stuck a thermometer into there. Obviously, it'll all burn up. They have data, and they use assumptions to then extrapolate back to, well, this has to come from this thing of burning at this temperature, et cetera, et cetera. Scientists use assumptions. Historians use assumptions. This diary is accurate. This photo is not doctored. This building was really built in 500 AD, and it's not a lie. It's not a joke. People are not trying to fool us. So they have to make assumptions. And futurists and people, everybody needs to make assumptions about the future. And these assumptions oftentimes they're valuable because they resolve uncertainty. You assume, let's assume that everybody in economics, that everybody is acting according to increasing their marginal utility in economic terms. Well, unless they're biased, unless they're not doing that, and that assumption is now challenged. 2 cases in the Gulf of Mexico, of course, and when we were in Houston, there are hurricanes, and Hurricane Katrina came into the Gulf of Mexico in 2005, hit New Orleans dead on in August of that year. The Louisiana State University did a plan for the evacuation of New Orleans, which is a serious thing because New Orleans is actually below sea level. And it is surrounded by levees to keep the river and the Gulf of Mexico and the lake out of the city. And one of the assumptions that LSU made was the levees will hold. Notice that's a future projection. The levees will hold. And they should make that assumption. But they should challenge that assumption. And they should have said, well, what if they don't? And they didn't challenge it. The levees did not hold. The city was flooded, one of the worst disasters in U.S. history, because they didn't. 3 weeks later, a hurricane came into the Gulf of Mexico called Hurricane Rita. For a time, it was pointed directly at the Houston area. A&M University at that time, Texas A&M, had made a plan for the evacuation of low-lying areas on the Texas coast, which could be flooded by storm surge. And they estimated that maybe 50,000 other people in Houston, where it's above sea level, might flee anyway. And so could the roads handle all of that population? No problem. That day, 1.2 million people chose to leave the Houston metropolitan area. This traffic jam lasted for 24 hours. Assumptions. Assumptions are important. So we should recognize our assumptions and we should challenge them again with what if. What if that assumption is not true? Then what kind of a future are we going to have? And this is thinking. This is just mindset. We're not talking about a process. We're not talking about being professionals. We're talking about being ordinary people in responsible positions in the world that should realize that we're making assumptions about the future that may or may not be, may or may not turn out. And then finally, we come to resilience. One of the good things about, I think, educational educators and teachers is they want to make knowledge and learning accessible. Bless their hearts. They do a good job. Textbooks, power worksheets, lectures, lab experiments. It's all set up so that the ordinary student can learn something in the process. Unfortunately, sometimes we make it so accessible that nobody is really asked to challenge themselves. Nobody is asked to try to do something that they've never done before. Now, maybe integrating a calculus equation is that, but for the most part, we do not challenge ourselves. And this is where, how do you learn to be resilient unless faced with situations in small, remember, like the vaccine, like the surprises, challenge ourselves in small ways so that if we are ever challenged in a big way, we have built up the habit of resilience and indeed confidence that, okay, now I'm being challenged. This is something new. I've never heard about this before, but I've been in this situation before and I can go forward to do it. So these are 5 ideas that I think capture the mindset that we're talking about, a foresight mindset that deals with the future in a contemporary way, not in the way that perhaps we may have picked up in school. And these are the 3 characteristics. Look widely. Look throughout the steep categories, throughout the transactional environment. Don't say, well, it's all about libraries. No, it's not all about. There's legislation, there's technology. Think deeper and indeed think longer in terms of what are the implications? How long will this occur? What might happen in the long run? But yes, we're going to now move from inbound change to outbound change. And the next 3 sessions are about the outbound change, about doing things, creating change within the context of the world. The world doesn't go away. It's still there. The people that sitting around the card table, they have strategies too. So you're going to have to play with and against them. But doing it both hand in hand with the world and with your colleagues, it's exactly what we're about. So we're just flipping to the outbound side for the next 3 sessions. Everybody, see you next week.
Okay. Thank you so much, Peter and Michelle.
Okay, absolutely.
No problem. Enjoyed it.